not gonna waste your time, it's supports. But why? Depending on who you ask, you're gonna get very different responses.
I don't think it's fair to call support anymore the easiest role in the game. I actually don't think that's totally fair. Overwatch 1, it absolutely was. But in Overwatch 2, I don't think there is an easiest role in the game anymore. I think that certain roles have more impact now, but I don't think there is such thing as an easiest role in the game anymore.
I would say support is the easiest because to do the most important part of a support in this game is to heal in most cases, right? And most supports in Overwatch have auto-aimed healing. That's the reasoning behind it being easier than other roles. On DPS, you don't have many easy DPS. Like sure, there's Junkrat, and that's, you know, kind of hilariously easy. But aside from that, supports have it somewhat easy in that regard. And they also have one of the most impactful kits, some of the best ultimates and abilities. Zenyatta, Baptiste, Ana. Aside from that, it's not rocket science.
Kiriko? Kiriko is extremely difficult to play at a high level.
To clear myself of as much bias as possible, I'm high Grandmaster on support, high Masters on tank, and low Masters on DPS. So, as a support player myself who plays ranked and in team play, I am telling you that support is the easiest role in the game. But just because something is the easiest doesn't mean it's easy. It could just mean that the other roles are harder to pull off. My main argument for this is the cost to reward ratio. In other words, supports generally have a higher rewards, but a lower cost compared to DPS and tanks. Cost will be broken down into 3 main categories: mechanics, risk, and cooldowns. The reward side of the equation will of course be embedded throughout. First off, let's start with mechanics. Now, I could very easily cherry pick some heroes in the DPS category, or even in the tank category and be like, yeah, the mechanics are much harder than someone like Moira's. But I'm not gonna do that. To help illustrate my point, I want to go over this high Grandmaster game on League Jack Night Market, where we have 2 of the most mechanically demanding supports in the game, Ana and Zen. We also have a highly mechanically demanding DPS with Tracer specifically. Let's see and compare what the Tracer and Ana do this fight. So mechanically, Tracer has a few things to worry about from the get-go. Her blink usage, her tracking, her trigger discipline, her terrain/cover usage, and eventually, her pulse bomb. And you can see how tough all these little bit of mechanics can be, as the Tracer almost gets forced out by the Lucio as the fight progresses. It's a tough job managing all those mechanics by yourself just to avoid dying, let alone trying to get any value. Meanwhile, mechanically, all the Ana needs to worry about is healing the Doomfist and landing nades. Sleep can be mechanically demanding, but it depends on the comp you're playing against, and it's not really what makes up most of Ana's value. That's in her nades, and as you can see, that's literally all you need to do on Ana. What about Zen? Well, it's more of the same story. Just hold down M1, orb your DPS, and wait until they rush you in this specific case. You might say Junkrat doesn't require mechanics here, which is mostly incorrect. Most of his value comes from landing your one-shot, and while your concussion mine isn't very hard to land, consistently landing your nades can be. But disregarding that, as we'll see in the risk section, the Junkrat, Tracer and Doomfist take on much more risk compared to the Ana Zen backline. Well, what about the tanks? Heroes like Reinhardt and Winston, and frankly main tanks in general, don't require much mechanics, right? Well, that's kind of right. Reinhardt and Winston do have cleave damage type weapons that don't require much mechanical skill, but Winston does have his primal, which has a really high skill ceiling. Sigma's hyperspheres are also hard to hit on squishies, and the same can be said for Zarya's beam, or even tracking on D.Va up close. Not to mention, Orisa really needs to be hitting on javelins and confirming kills with it in order to be effective. So on the whole, I'd say that tanks, while not as mechanically demanding as someone like Tracer, they're not easy either. Comparing this to supports, most supports have automated or targeted healing, and excluding that, there's obviously supports like Moira and Brig, who are well known for not needing too much mechanical skill. But I do want to mention heroes like Kiriko. Even Flats brought this up. Kiriko from both a mechanical and playstyle point of view can be really tough to nail down at the highest level. However, even then, the second category, risk, really shows how little risk there is to playing a support like Kiriko. It's why in Pro League, you're seeing Kiriko's hard flank all the time, because if they get pressured, they can just TP out with no risk. In fairness, this critique of Kiriko being low risk only applies to her, but think back to that Ana example. What risk is Ana taking by throwing that nades? Even Zen, what risk is he taking by using his Discord and Harmony orbs? Now, to give some leniency, heroes like Ana and Zen can be really tough to play against when you're playing against Dive. As Flat said, Because Overwatch 2 is a significantly more dynamic game than Overwatch 1, supports just can't sit in their backline and heal anymore. They have to keep constantly moving as the fight goes on and when they get dove. You can see CJ from the LA Valiant doing this after he gets dove. He doesn't just stand still, he moves and rotates back to create some distance which keeps him safe. This links onto the point Odo brought up earlier, to also decrease risk, especially against dive. Heroes like Moira and especially Brig exist to give you more survivability. Simply put, it's why Brig Honor is so common in the Overwatch League. Take this dive here from the Mayhem and Infernal. Infernal use EMP, and the dive from Infernal is still relatively coordinated. Yet, Florida's backline somehow stays alive. Or even take this example where I just press E on Brigitte 3 times and my Hanzo still lives through a Somber Tracer and Wrecking Ball dive. This again links onto the point Odo brought up earlier with healing, in that most supports have some form of automated or targeted healing. The Somber Tracer and Wrecking Ball need to have competent mechanics, when in comparison, I can just press my E button 3 times. It's kinda stupid. It nullifies most of the risk that you take against a dive. What about tanks? Well, they're the definition of risk. I haven't brought up Doomfist yet, but look at how Doom just gets Thanos snapped at the highest levels. Thankfully, for main tanks, it wasn't as bad as it was back in Overwatch 1, but you're still taking risks to create space for your team because everyone's going to be looking at you. As soon as you walk in on Reinhardt, shout and walk forward on Queen, pop Nemesis on Ramattra, or spear spin in on Narisa, you're going to have the whole gang chase after you. Down to the last section, cooldowns. This one is a little bit more ambiguous, but it essentially means how long the cooldowns are for your abilities, and it also means how impactful your ultimate is. I think it goes without saying that supports generally have the most powerful pieces of utility and ultimates in the game, and while that doesn't make them easy to use, it's all about that cost-reward ratio. If the cost of using support ultimates is the same as tank or DPS ones, yet the reward is higher, there's a clear discrepancy. I think Transcendence, Beat, Rally, and Nano Boost are clear examples. Your tank could be getting pounded, but pressing Q and Honor reverts that entirely. As for tank and DPS ultimates, the obvious elephant in the room is EMP. But EMP isn't even a free teamfight win anymore. Sure, it is one of the most rewarding ults in the game, but even the cost of using EMP is all too high when you need to make sure that your team can actually follow up off your EMP, and again, this isn't even a guarantee. I mean, look at Pro League, referring back to that Soul Infernal example. So, as a summary, why do I think that supports are the easiest role in the game? Well, their mechanics are generally easier, whether it be their automated healing that doesn't require aim, or even when they're not healing, their utility is relatively easy to land. Honor's Biotic Nade is a perfect example. Their ultimates are also not particularly hard to use, but can often be pretty rewarding, and certain heroes can decrease the risk supports carry, and I haven't even mentioned the support passive too. There is one factor I haven't considered, and that's positioning, which isn't easy to master at all. It's a really big factor that helps decrease your risk when playing support, and is probably the most important thing when you're playing support into dive. Again, as Flat said, support isn't an easy role anymore. So, if you're struggling with your positioning, I recommend checking out any of my support guides, linked in the top right. And that's it for the video. Shout out to my tier 2 Patreon and channel member, Broken by 50%, as well as my other members, Benny, T-Meg, Chris Jones, Craig, 9socks, Resolucio, and Sasfring. And let me know your thoughts down below. Until next time.